I'm going to play this in its entirety.
That's the problem.
If you like, he's having this fight now with Canada and Mexico.
It's not. That's the problem.
If you like, he's having this fight now with Canada.
That's actually a very good example that you gave. So
He's changing his mind on it. I get the sense of you. Like, meaning, I get Pezeshkian is saying, yes, I'm aligning. Fair enough.
okay.
We'll start the interview now. I am joined with Professor Marandi. He is a good friend of the show. I appreciate him for joining me, especially with all the tech issues that we're having. I am on my cell phone because I'm having tech issues. Professor, thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate you being me on the show.
Thank you for having me. Just so that your viewers know why we're laughing, you were interviewing me for the last 10, 15 minutes, but I thought we were just having a conversation. And then I realized that this was an interview, and so we just restarted.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm sorry. I didn't. That's on me. The reason I put you on. So there was a clip that was floating around on Twitter where Pezeshkian, the caption of the clip was Pezeshkian is angry at the Ayatollah because he wants to effectively make a deal, whereas Ayatollah does not want to have any deals under a bullying of Donald Trump. And the clip was effectively saying that he was angry. Now, you pointed out to me that is not the context of the clip, that this is not what is taking place in this clip. So give me your take on what is going on in that clip, just so the audience will understand why you're saying that the clip is not given the correct caption in regards to what's happening.
Right. So President Pezeshkian is giving a speech to Parliament. And in Parliament, because it's a very huge hall and the MPs are always talking, the speaker always speaks loud. And so the person who doesn't speak Persian may think he's angry. They took out a small clip, and it may sound angry to someone who doesn't know what he's saying, but he's not angry. He's just giving a speech to a very large and noisy hall full of people. Then he says that I don't have the text in front of me or the Persian in front of me, but he said that I believe that we should negotiate with Americans, but when the leader said that we're not going to negotiate, I aligned myself with the leader. And that's it. And that's it. That's what he said. And that's it. And then he says, so we have to move on. In other words, we're not talking about this anymore. My words, and find solutions to our problems without negotiating with the Americans. So there's no argument, there's no anger, contrary to what some people have been claiming. There are different views. Obviously, he said himself in Parliament that his views were different from the leader. They may still be different from the leader, but he said, I'm going to align myself with the leader's position. I think this shows many things. One, it shows that contrary to what the West likes to claim, in Iran, people have very differing views. The president, the leader, other senior officials, ordinary people, media, and they express them openly. And in the West, they call that democracy and checks and balances. But when it comes to Iran, somehow there's a division within the regime and that sort of thing. So, of course, it's quite possible that the president's position has changed, because some people's positions have changed over the past few days since Trump has been making all these extraordinary statements and have so the example of NAFTA, where Trump himself brought changes to the NAFTA agreement during his previous presidency, and he then said this was a fantastic deal. Perhaps he said it's the best deal in the world, because he says that a lot. And then now he imposes sanctions or tariffs, or wants to impose tariffs. He keeps fluctuating. And that's another issue, by the way. He wants to impose tariffs because it's such a horrible relationship or a horrible deal that exists between Canada and the United States or Mexico and the United States. So if he can't abide by his own commitments, then how can Iran ever trust an American negotiator that works with him, that he'll be able to deliver, that anything that some American negotiator signs will be implemented? How could the Iranians ever believe that or have confidence in that? Or, for example, more recently, the Americans are, and other Westerners, but the Americans are guarantors for both the ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon, on the border between Palestine and Lebanon. Today, the Israeli regime murdered a Lebanese soldier and wounded a woman, and they murdered, the regime, its soldiers, murdered 2 Palestinians in Gaza. They've been doing that regularly for the past few months since the ceasefire. Has the guarantor done anything about it? Of course not. The Israelis have been violating the agreement both in Gaza and in Lebanon. Are the Americans, as the guarantor, doing anything about it? Absolutely not. They continue to occupy bits and pieces of southern Lebanon. Is the guarantor going to do anything about it? Definitely not. All of these are things that the Iranians are watching. They see these happening and taking place, and they say, well, then how can we negotiate with this person? Or the deal in Gaza. If you recall, after the ceasefire, which Trump and his representative was deeply involved in bringing about the day before his inauguration, after that, he said the Palestinians must leave Gaza. In other words, the third phase is unnecessary. He helped negotiate the third phase. His representatives brought about that deal. But then days later, he says, we must ethnically cleanse Gaza. Or when he spoke about, when he threatened Hamas and said all the so-called hostages must be immediately released by Saturday or whatever.
Yeah.
Hamas and its allies are working within the framework of the deal. Trump doesn't accept the deal that he led. He was behind the negotiations. So Iran looks at all of this and says, how can we negotiate with this person? And then he threatens Iran. He says Iran has to give up its, his government says Iran has to give up its conventional weapons, its peaceful nuclear program. That's Iran's nuclear program is monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iran is abiding by its commitments within the framework of international law. But the Americans are insisting that Iran has to forsake its rights as a sovereign country to a nuclear program. None of this is acceptable to Iran, and it's just not going to happen. So Trump is seen as constantly tearing up his own deals, and he's constantly shifting his position. And then he's making outrageous threats. What sane person would negotiate with such a person and have any realistic hope that a deal that's agreed upon will ever be implemented? And then you have Zelensky. I mean, I have no sympathy for Zelensky and the Zelensky regime. The United States, of course, created Zelensky, and now the United States is destroying him. But Trump went and humiliated him when he knows very well that Zelensky is a product of the United States. He was created by the United States. So how can anyone negotiate with the United States when a foreign leader is humiliated in front of a global audience in the White House like that? Or, for example, the King of Jordan, if you recall how he was humiliated in the White House and how he kept blinking, the King of Jordan. This sort of behavior basically leads any sane person that an agreement with the United States is almost impossible under these circumstances. Meaning almost impossible for it to be implemented.
No, that's fair. And you're right. They got rid of the JCPOA. That was another example where Trump effectively destroyed the JCPOA, despite the fact that it was a negotiated deal. And you're also right that these bullying tactics is effectively the way that Donald Trump seems to operate. He is hyperbolic, and yet he sends people in to try to make deals behind the scenes while he's on the outside being hyperbolic. I guess my thing is, though, Pezeshkian,
But sorry for interrupting. But the point is, he sends people to do the negotiations, and then when the deal is signed, like in Gaza, he goes and says, "No, I don't accept the deal." That's the issue. It's his deal. The ceasefire deal is his deal, basically. And then he says, "No, the Palestinians must leave altogether. They have to leave Gaza completely."
So if not negotiation, then what? Because the government seemingly seems to want to negotiate. I mean, I accept everything you're saying. Everything you're saying is completely true. All of it is correct. Trump is an unreliable actor in regards to the way he engages. I want to say North Korea is different. Why do you think North Korea is different? Donald Trump with the whole Rocket Man stuff, and yet he still went over, shook his hand, etc., and stuck to, despite the pressure that he was getting in the United States about making that deal. And he also seems.
Yeah, actually, the foreign minister of North Korea had a conversation with Iranians after Trump went to the border and met the North Korean leader. And the Iranians asked the foreign minister, what was Trump like? And he said, the North Korean foreign minister, that everything was fine. But as soon as Trump left the room, when Bolton and Pompeo took over, they wrecked everything. So whether it's like with Gaza, where his negotiators do a deal and then Trump rejects it, or whether it's Trump doing negotiations and the people working for him reject it, it doesn't matter. The point is that Trump is seen as someone who can't be trusted, someone who we cannot negotiate with, someone who is not a reliable person to deal with. That the only route left for Iran. I mean, again, I don't know if President Pezeshkian still believes that we should negotiate, but he said publicly that I align myself with the leader. This discussion is over. That's basically what President Pezeshkian was saying, and that's why we no longer have this public debate, because he has aligned himself with the leader. So I don't know if he still believes in negotiations, especially because, as I said, after the last few days have been really, has put Trump in a much more negative light, even than before. But at the end, regardless of who believes in negotiations and who doesn't, Iran is not going to negotiate. Iran is going to deal with other countries, all other countries except for the Israeli regime and the United States. Of course, Iran will continue to, their messages continue to go back and forth between Iran and the United States. That has always happened and will continue to happen. At least that's what's going on now. That hasn't changed. They send messages through different parties, and the Iranians respond. That won't change, as far as I know. But Iran's policy will be to continue expanding ties with the global South, or the global majority, as many now call it, Russia, China, neighboring countries, Central Asia countries, and so on, BRICS, and so on. And Iran will wait until it feels that the United States has changed its, what would be the best word, has changed its attitude, has fundamentally changed its attitude. Until then, there won't be negotiations. So either at some point, Trump is going to have to change his attitude completely and treat Iran with respect and withdraw unreasonable demands and show or prove that a deal that is signed by the United States will be respected. If that one day happens, hypothetically, 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, then I presume that Iran would be willing to negotiate. But until that happens, I do not see negotiations taking place.
If not negotiations, what do you see taking place moving on from here? Meaning if negotiations are off the table. And Ayatollah said, he said flat out, we are not going to accept negotiations under
That's right.
threat of bullying.
It's going to be business as usual. We'll continue to be doing what we're doing now. Maybe there'll be new opportunities in Europe because of the divisions between Europe and the United States. That remains to be seen. But Iran will continue expanding relations with countries across the global south. And I should add that Trump, this administration is not the administration that came to power 8 years ago. The United States is not as strong as it was back then. And other countries are more assertive than they were back then. Iran is more assertive now, Russia more assertive, and China more assertive. 8 years ago, we saw the Chinese showing great flexibility. Now that's not really the case. And part of it is because the Americans have imposed so many sanctions and tariffs that they've lost most of their leverage against China. And the Chinese know that the Americans are not going to stop. So that has actually been an incentive for China to improve relations with Iran and other countries, because they know that the door to better relations with the United States is shut. The same is true with Russia. Even though the Russians and the Americans are now talking, Trump keeps saying different things. Every day you hear a different sort of statement coming from Trump. And it's not clear. I mean, the negotiations will continue, and ultimately there may be some sort of peace deal in Ukraine, but it's not going to be that simple. And I don't think that the Russians are going to put any eggs in Trump's basket, or at least they're not going to take any eggs out of the Iranian or Chinese basket and put it in the Trump basket, because they know that Trump is not trustworthy, it's not reliable. And even if he was, who's to say that when he leaves power, the next president will not overturn everything? That's how the United States has become.
That's the rub. I mean, because for the speed that Donald Trump went in order to try to make deals with Russia and kind of unravel, that speed could also be used again with the next president to unravel.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you this.
And the divisions in the United States are deep.
Yeah.
And what Trump is now doing to his enemies is far more painful to them inside the United States, that the so-called deep state, or the opposition, is far more painful to them than what he did 8 years ago. This time around, he's hitting them hard, and where it hurts, financially, USAID, NED, and so on, and the list goes on. So these people will be seeking revenge, and Iran sees that. So, and others see that. So they're saying, well, how do we know who's going to be in charge 4 years from now? And again, as you point out, who's to say that they're not going to reverse all of what's happened with the same speed as Trump made these changes over the last few weeks?
Can you tell me the security agreements between Russia and Iran? What is that relationship? Because there was a conversation that Trump wanted to use Russia to make negotiations with Iran. Basically, once he solidifies whatever kind of relationship he has with Russia, to use that relationship as a way to kind of make some kind of agreement, I guess, in a back channel way with Iran. Give me your thoughts on that. And I guess just to put a final point on it, the security agreements between Iran and Russia, this was something that they signed, I believe it was several months ago. What does it entail?
Actually, it was quite recent. It was right before Trump came to power. But the agreement has been discussed and negotiated for a very long time. It's a very comprehensive deal. It includes everything: military, political cooperation, most importantly, in my opinion, economic cooperation, the North-South corridor, gas and oil cooperation. Both countries have huge oil and gas reserves. Russia is #1 in the world with regards to natural gas. Iran is #2. And then right between them, there lies Turkmenistan, which has huge gas reserves too. So, and then Russian grains can be exported through Iran. Iran could be a hub for gas, for oil, for wheat, for grains. And then Iran, of course, would have access to the Russian market and Europe later on. When there is peace, then the North-South corridor would be a much better route for trade between Europe and Asia than the other corridors. So, or at least parts of Europe. So that, I think, makes it a very important agreement.
Right.
But with regards to using Russia to negotiate, no, I don't see that happening at all. The Americans may want to send a message to Iran through Russia. That's fine. They do that through other people too. If you recall, the former Japanese Prime Minister Abe, when he came to Iran with Trump's message, and the leader refused to take it, and Abe put it under him. He hid it under his leg during his talks with the leader. He refused to take the deal. But the point is that Trump and others do send messages to Iran through different means. But if it is like, if the Americans want the Russians to be to negotiate on Iran's behalf or anything like that, that's not going to happen. I don't think the Russians have such expectations at all, and Iran will not do such a thing, because Iran will always be able to negotiate for itself.
Interesting. That is so interesting. Wow. Okay. I think we've covered it. I mean, you've made the point. I'm curious, one last thing. What are the messages that they are sending back channel?
Well,
I mean,
I wouldn't be interviewed. I'd be in these, behind the scenes. I don't know what the messages are, but from what we're hearing in the public discourse, Trump's messages have, or what we've heard from Trump himself, that he sent a message to Iran. They're aggressive. They have their unreasonable expectations. The demands violate Iran's sovereignty, and therefore Trump has basically forced Iran to shut the door, and that door will remain shut until someone on the other side is seen as behaving reasonably and who is capable of doing a deal and implementing it. We already have a bad history with the United States. Whenever we dealt with the United States, they violated the agreements from the 1980s onwards, and from the beginning of the revolution onwards. And the most famous instance was the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, where as soon as it was signed, Obama began to violate the deal. And then ultimately, Trump tore up the deal. And after Trump tore up the deal, Iran continued to abide by the deal for a full year in full, all of its obligations. whereas the Americans and the Europeans were violating all of their obligations. And then only after a year did Iran begin to halt implementation in stages, which that took another year. So whenever the Europeans or the Americans complain about Iran violating the nuclear deal, I think you should expect the Iranians to roll their eyes and smirk, probably.
Pezeshkian knew that. Like everything you just said, he knew it. In fact, I would say everything that we've talked about in this interview, he knows, and yet he was still, meaning, take out Trump for a moment. Even with Trump not being there, the United States was not an honest actor in any of these negotiations. I mean, we pulled out of all the nuclear agreements with Russia, we destroyed the Minsk agreements, we blew off the Istanbul agreements, as you pointed out, the JCPOA. Donald Trump has blown off every trade deal that he's made with Mexico and China. Pezeshkian knew that already. So what was his motivation to try to make a deal with the United States if indeed there was this level of distrust in the relationship?
I don't know. I'm not like in his inner circle. I would assume that he was probably saying, well, let's give it a try.
Yep.
But I think the logic that those given by those who oppose negotiations. Now, there's some who just oppose negotiations, and I don't mean them. There are a certain group of Iranians who will always refrain from negotiations. That's not the position of the leader, because he has allowed negotiations to take place in the past. What he's doing now is saying no negotiations now, because he wants to teach the Americans that they have to change. They have to change their mentality. They have to change their behavior. So I think the leader is saying no. Negotiating under these circumstances will be too costly. It will be a waste of time. It will have a negative influence on Iranian markets. The markets will go just like what Trump does with the U.S. markets nowadays. One day there's going to be sanctions, the next day there are no sanctions. The stock market falls, then it goes back up, and God knows why he does this. A lot of people think that they're making a lot of money this way because people sell their stocks, and then right before Trump backs up. Yeah, who knows? Who knows why he does this? But
he's trying to back to the U.S. and he believes that tariffs is one of the ways to do it. Basically, if he makes it so costly for people to do business outside of the United States, so they're bringing their companies back into the U.S., this is not going to work.
Yeah,
like global.
Of course. I mean, one of those companies that's going to be hit hardest, for example, is General Motors.
Yes.
But in any case, which is an American company. But the point is that the leader and others who believe that we shouldn't negotiate now, what they're saying is that this is only going to have a negative impact on Iranian markets, on the Iranian economy, and it's just going to create false expectations, and then those expectations will be crushed, and then that will just hurt Iran. So no negotiations until the Americans come to their senses.
By the way, Russia had to go through the same thing. Like the only reason Donald Trump is having negotiations with Russia is because Russia beat him on the battlefield.
Exactly. And right now, Americans, they don't feel, or at least they say that, because there is this false narrative. This is something new about Russia. For 3 years, everyone's been saying in the West, not you and not me, not people who we speak with. We've always been saying that they will not defeat Russia and that Russia will win. We've been saying this since day one. During the nuclear negotiations, the war began. I was in Vienna, and I was telling Western elites and diplomats to do a deal with Iran because your economies are going to get very bad because of the sanctions against Russia. And they were all saying, no, we'll defeat Russia in a few weeks. Russia's going to be crushed. Putin's going to be overthrown. And I kept saying that's just not going to happen. You haven't been able to overthrow Cuba. You haven't been able to overthrow Venezuela. How are you going to overthrow Russia? How are you going to overthrow Iran? But that mentality existed for almost 3 years. And now, since it's become very clear that Russia has won the war, Trump has no option but to retreat and he can blame it on the previous regime. Anyone who looks carefully would see that Trump, when he was president for a year, during the previous Trump administration, that he was pursuing the same policies as Obama and Biden. He didn't slow down the move towards confrontation with Russia. But in any case, he can blame Biden and pull back and talk about, taking Greenland or Canada or whatever, so that to distract people away from the weakness that exists and the defeat that we see in Ukraine. So now is the right time for Russia to negotiate because they're in a position of strength. The Americans, I think they have to first recognize that they have to come to that recognition that no, they're not winning against Iran. They're not winning against the axis of resistance. This is the same nonsense that they've been saying about Russia for the past 3 years. And as long as the Americans and the West have that silly assumption, negotiations are not going to bear fruit because.
All right, I'm going to end the interview on that because shortly after that, the interview goes haywire because my phone effectively died. Professor Marandi, shout out to him. Thank him for that. Like I said, he was very patient with all of the glitches and everything else that took place.